Okay, let's try it this time round. Yes, the audio is not working on the last one, so this is going to be the fast abbreviated version because I've already done this set of notes, but without sound. So here we go, starting right off the bat. Next set of notes is on social reform. Once this pulls up, we're going to go through in 10 minutes because I'm going to just zip through it. Okay. All right, here we go. All right, where is it? Okay, so this section of notes is on social reform. So with all the things that we had talked about before, we are looking at making changes or reforming all of these things that are going on. Like you have the factories where kids worked in. It could be education. It could be other ills, social ills that are going on. Now reform can come in many ways. It can come peaceful or it can come in the violent form, which you see right here, which is more of a revolution than a reform, or else they're just stabbing this guy because he's a vampire or something. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is the temperance movement. Temperance movement we have talked about before. This was in the early 1900s, the one we talked about, because it was the pulling away of alcohol from the states, which did not fare very well, but they pushed temperance, or the idea of moderation, taking things slowly or moderately. In this case, it was alcohol. So if you look at this picture of this guy, kind of drunk off the side of the road, and they have this imagery of this dragon or this spirit coming up out of it. And that's kind of the idea, is that people were feeling that alcohol was causing them social problems, and also in the familial unit as well. Maybe not so much with the squirrels on the ground, but maybe this guy where it says Les Victimes de Alcool, which in French means the victims of alcohol, where they have their hands, their grip on this guy, and it's leading to cause some problems for him. So with whiskey, some background on alcohol back then, is whiskey was actually cheaper than milk or beer. So it's much more readily available, and alcohol was safer to drink than typically water was. If you think back to the time period, water just really came straight up out of the ground. It wasn't treated like we have today to get rid of the bacteria and other things that might go into the water, into the wells and things like that. So alcohol was actually cheaper and safer. And this movement of temperance or moderation was led by women, much like many of your other reforms. And it makes sense because women were lacking in a lot of these rights that they were wanting others to have as well. So perhaps the idea that if they help to lead others to get these rights, then they might get theirs also. And because once the men left the house or were at bars or whatever, then they would be in charge of the family unit. And that could be problematic. I'm not saying that females, running it would be problematic, but you want your whole family there. So they called for the prohibition or prohibiting of sale and the consumption of alcohol. And in 1850s, 9 states banned the sale of alcohol. But it ended much like the one in the 1900s. It just doesn't last very long because people want it. If they want it, they're going to find a way to get it, and they do. But this gives the idea that reform does work, or changes in society. In this case, the next one up is prisons. Now, prisons were very harsh places back at the time period. And I know some people are going to say, well, they should be for good reason. But once we talk about it, maybe it'll make a little more sense. So in this case, the prisons were cramped. You had poor heat, you had bad food. And even if you're someone who thinks criminals should be treated poorly, here's where the problem occurs, is that these prisons were often filled with not criminals, or at least that we don't consider criminals by society in modern times. Here it says they were often filled with debtors. Debtors are people who owe money and not necessarily criminals. So imagine these prisons full of people who don't necessarily need to be there, like debtors. Anybody who owed money for some reason or couldn't pay it, you'd be thrown in there with criminals. And that too is problematic because now these people might get abused in there. They might turn to real crime themselves. So that's an issue, that you're putting people who didn't commit a crime in with real criminals. So it comes upon a woman named Dorothea Dix, who's a school teacher. As she had heard about the problems in these early prisons, and she wanted to investigate the conditions of these various prisons because she had heard that they were corrupt, they were immoral, and other things were going on in there. So she did investigate it, and she found that prisons had, as we said, wrong people in there, and they found that they also had mentally ill people who were in these bad conditions. The ways back then was that if you had someone in your family who was mentally ill and you couldn't take care of them, that oftentimes they would just get thrown into these prisons, places, and mistreated. Mostly because medicine was not really where it was today, and people just didn't know how to take care of those people who had mental illness. So she writes a book it gets out to the media, and people are made aware of all of these places now that have the wrong people in them. So it's prison reform, but also it's reform for those who have mental illness. In this case, separate asylums are made for those who are mentally ill. Now, this does not solve the problems for those people who have mental illness or special needs, because this is your 1800s and people really didn't know anything. I mean, we had lobotomies well into, like, I believe, like 1950s, 1960s, where they thought that removal of parts of the brain could solve these mental issues that people were having, which was a little bit absurd. But anyways, it's a step in the right direction. And then the third one that we're going to look at, man, we are going to knock this out pretty quick. I really did talk a lot more on the other one, but I'm a little annoyed that this thing didn't work out the first time around. So anyways, education also needs reform because of the issues of kids not going to school, and the idea that only certain kids could go to school, and it was mostly made for those who were wealthy, those who were rich. Your earliest schools, it says, were started for religious purposes, and those are called parochial schools. If you think back to last year, we talked about this in the medieval time period, that your earliest universities and schools actually came from churches, mostly because they had learned people who were there, but also they were the only ones who could, afford to do it and had a place where people could come to school. So these early schools, religious in nature, called parochial schools. We still have those today. Usually those are private schools, like an LCC, Lima Central Catholic, and Lima Temple Christian. Both are Christian schools, but their education and religion go hand in hand there. Now, Massachusetts comes in as the first public school. The public schools are a little bit different than parochial, because this is where the state pays for it for the most part. They're paid by taxes. So similar to what we have today, where the states will pay for a portion of it, a percentage, and then the community where it is actually pays for the rest of it. So your first public school comes into play in Massachusetts because, again, even there, wealthy children went to school and the poor did not. So Horace Mann comes in from Massachusetts and becomes the head of the state school board, where he decides to make some changes. The first thing is that he created teacher colleges. You didn't have a lot of education or schooling for people, particularly to be trained to be teachers. In most cases, it was single females. And if they got married, then they probably wouldn't teach anymore. And the second thing is it raised teacher salaries. Teachers did not get paid very much back then. I'm not going to say things have changed much here either, but a lot of times you got room and you got board, and you'd be shuffled in between the different students' houses that you taught, and you would just stay there and eat with them. Yeah, who wants to do that today? And volunteers? Nobody? Crickets? Crickets? Okay, completely understand. So it raises the teacher salary, but also it makes people want to do it if they get paid better than they normally would. It also lengthened the school year. He lengthened the school year. So these three big changes are important, especially this last one, because a lot of kids, especially middle lower class kids who were farmers' kids, you oftentimes only went to school in like one season, and that was the winter time, when you're not needed as much in the family farm, whereas in spring and summer, fall, you are. So he lengthened the school year to more 2/3 of a year, and then kids can get more education. So you can thank Horace Mann for that one. Other changes, this one kind of crosses over for both education, but also for race, in that education for African Americans was very lacking too. So you had to find a way for African Americans to get educated. In a lot of cases, it was them educating themselves and having their own schools, or someone coming up with one and only having it for African Americans. So because these race restrictions, they were limited on their education. But you did have some early schools, like you had one in Connecticut. However, a lot of times these end up getting destroyed by arson or whatever, because people think that blacks should be educated, even in the North. Connecticut's in the North. However, some schools do step up, like Harvard and Oberlin, right there in Ohio, which did allow for African Americans to attend college. And the first college for African American men was in 1854, just a few short years from the Civil War, at the Ashman Institute. So those are your three main reforms that we'll talk about: is education, or to talk about education, prisons, and moderation. All things in moderation and temperance. So where does this lead us? This leads us to abolitionist movement. and the Underground Railroad, which will be in your next set of notes, and it's a social reform unto itself. So there you go. Much faster set of notes. My apologies for the audio not working. Hopefully I'll drop this soon and get taken care of. See ya.